The summer heat was unbearable in London that Tuesday afternoon, and 17-year-old Jake Morrison was already regretting his decision to join the school trip to England. He stood with his group of friends outside Buckingham Palace, sweat dripping down his forehead as he watched the endless stream of tourists taking photos and pointing excitedly at everything around them. Jake had always been the class clown back home in Philadelphia, known for his quick wit and ability to make people laugh, even when it meant getting into trouble. "This is so boring," Jake muttered to his best friend Alex, who was busy scrolling through his phone instead of paying attention to their tour guide. "We've been standing here for like 20 minutes, just waiting for some guys in funny hats to walk around. I could be playing video games right now instead of sweating in this stupid heat, watching grown men play dress-up." Their group consisted of 12 students from Jefferson High School, all between 16 and 18 years old, who had saved money for 2 years to afford this educational trip to Europe. Most of the students were genuinely excited about experiencing British culture and history. But Jake and his 3 closest friends had already decided they were too cool for what they called tourist trap nonsense. They had spent the morning making jokes about everything they saw, from the accents of their British tour guides to the architecture of the historic buildings. Alex Thompson, Jake's partner in mischief, was a tall, lanky kid with bleached blonde hair who loved being the center of attention almost as much as Jake did. He had been documenting their entire trip on social media, posting videos and photos with captions that mocked everything they encountered. His followers back home ate up his content, encouraging him to be even more outrageous with each post. The third member of their group was Maria Santos, a sharp-tongued girl who had earned a reputation for her brutal honesty and cutting remarks. She came from a wealthy family and had initially been reluctant to join the school trip, considering it beneath her social status. However, her parents had insisted she'd participate for the cultural enrichment, and now she was determined to prove that everything European was overrated and pretentious. The fourth member was Danny Chen, a quiet kid who usually followed along with whatever the group decided to do. He was naturally introverted but craved acceptance from his more popular classmates, so he often found himself participating in activities that made him uncomfortable. Deep down, Danny was actually fascinated by the history and traditions surrounding them, but he would never admit that to his friends. Their teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was busy trying to manage the other 8 students who were asking legitimate questions about the palace and showing genuine interest in learning. She had already warned Jake's group twice about their disruptive behavior and inappropriate comments, but she was overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping 12 teenagers focused and respectful in a foreign country. As the afternoon wore on, word began to spread through the crowd that the famous changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Tourists started positioning themselves for better views. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, and the atmosphere became charged with anticipation. The ceremony was one of the most popular attractions in London, drawing thousands of visitors daily who came to witness the precision and pageantry of the British military tradition. Jake noticed the excitement building around them and saw an opportunity for entertainment. "Oh great," he said loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Here comes the big show. I bet they're going to march around in circles and pretend it's really important." His comment drew disapproving looks from a British family standing nearby, but Jake felt emboldened by what he perceived as successful comedy. Alex immediately pulled out his phone and started recording, sensing that Jake was building up to something that would make great content for his social media accounts. "This is going to be hilarious," he whispered to Maria, who was already smirking in anticipation of whatever Jake had planned. The crowd continued to grow as more tourists gathered to witness the ceremony. Jake found himself surrounded by people from all over the world who had traveled thousands of miles specifically to see this tradition. There were elderly couples who had dreamed of visiting London their entire lives, families who had saved money for years to afford this vacation, and history enthusiasts who understood the deep cultural significance of what they were about to witness. But Jake saw none of this. All he saw was an opportunity to prove how clever and fearless he was by making fun of something that everyone else seemed to take seriously. He had no understanding of the centuries of tradition he was about to mock, the rigorous training the guards had undergone, or the respect that millions of people around the world held for this ceremony as the first notes of military music began. To echo across the palace courtyard, Jake positioned himself where his voice would carry clearly through the crowd. He had no idea that his next few minutes would teach him lessons about respect, consequences, and the power of tradition that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would humble him in ways he never imagined possible, in front of an audience that would judge him far more harshly than any classroom back home ever could. The changing of the guard ceremony began with the sound of military bands playing traditional British marches, their brass instruments gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The precision of the musicians was immediately apparent as they marched. In perfect formation, their steps synchronized to create a rhythmic thundering that echoed off the palace walls. For most of the crowd, this was a moment of genuine awe and respect for a tradition that had continued unbroken for centuries. Jake, however, saw it as prime material for mockery. "Oh, wow, look at them," he said in an exaggerated voice that carried clearly through the quiet crowd. "They're walking really slowly and playing music. This must have taken years of training to master." His sarcastic tone was impossible to miss, and several tourists turned to look at him with expressions of disapproval and embarrassment. Alex was recording everything, encouraging Jake with whispered comments and laughter. The two friends fed off each other's energy, each trying to be more outrageous than the other. "Make sure you get this," Jake told Alex while gesturing dramatically at the approaching guards. "Future historians will want to study this incredible display of ... walking in straight lines." The guards who were participating in the ceremony were members of the elite household division, soldiers who had earned their positions through rigorous training and demonstrated excellence in military service. These were not ceremonial actors, but active duty servicemen who took immense pride in their role as protectors of the British royal family. The red tunics they wore were not costumes, but official military uniforms with a heritage dating back hundreds of years. As the new guard approached the palace, their bearskin hats towering above their heads and their rifles held at perfect angles, Jake's commentary became louder and more disruptive. "I love the fuzzy hats," he announced to anyone within earshot. "Do you think they have to brush them every morning? Maybe they use special hat shampoo?" His friends burst into laughter, completely oblivious to the growing anger among the tourists. Around them, a middle-aged British man standing near Jake finally spoke up. "Excuse me, young man, but this is a solemn ceremony with great historical significance. Perhaps you could show some respect." His polite but firm tone should have been a warning to Jake, but instead it only encouraged him to become more defiant. "Oh, I'm sorry," Jake replied with mock contrition, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I didn't realize that watching people walk around was such a sacred religious experience. Please forgive my ignorance about the deep spiritual meaning of fancy uniforms and shiny buttons." The British man's face reddened with anger, but he remained silent, not wanting to create an even bigger scene. Maria joined in the mockery, pointing at the guards' pristine white gloves and perfectly polished boots. "Look at how seriously they're taking themselves," she said loudly. "Do you think they practice their serious faces in the mirror? I bet they have classes on how to look really, really important while doing absolutely nothing useful." And he felt increasingly uncomfortable with his friend's behavior, but didn't have the courage to speak up. He could see the hurt and anger in the faces of the people around them, many of whom had traveled great distances specifically to witness this ceremony. An elderly American couple looked particularly upset, and Danny overheard the woman whisper to her husband, "Those children are ruining it for everyone." The ceremony continued despite the disruption, with the old guard preparing to be relieved of their duty. The precision of their movements was extraordinary, each step calculated and rehearsed countless times until it became second nature. The guards maintained perfect posture, despite carrying heavy rifles and wearing wool uniforms in the summer heat. Their dedication to duty was evident in every aspect of their performance. Jake seemed to interpret the guards' professionalism as weakness, unable to understand that their refusal to respond to his taunts was actually a demonstration of superior discipline and training. "They can't even hear us," he declared triumphantly. "They're like robots. Hey, robot soldiers, can you do tricks? Can you roll over and play dead?" The crowd around Jake's group had grown increasingly hostile, with many people openly expressing their disgust at the teenager's behavior. A tour guide from Germany was explaining to her group in broken English how disrespectful the American students were being, while a family from Japan had actually moved to a different location to avoid being associated with the disruption. Mrs. Patterson finally noticed what was happening and began pushing through the crowd to reach her students. But the ceremony was reaching its climax, and the crowd was too thick for her to move quickly. She could hear Jake's voice carrying over the sound of the military band, and her heart sank as she realized that her students were creating an international incident that would likely have serious consequences. The moment of truth was approaching as the ceremony moved into its most formal phase, where the old guard would officially transfer responsibility to the new guard. This was traditionally the most solemn moment of the entire ceremony, and even the most casual tourists typically fell silent out of respect for the ritual they were witnessing. Jake had no idea that his continued mockery during this sacred moment would finally provoke a response that would shock him into silence and teach him a lesson he would never forget. The climax of the ceremony arrived as the officer of the guard stepped forward to officially transfer the keys and responsibility from the old guard to the new guard. This moment represented the unbroken chain of duty that had protected the British monarchy for generations. A tradition so sacred that even the most irreverent tourists typically observed it with respectful silence. The crowd of thousands naturally quieted, creating an atmosphere of reverence that had been building throughout the entire ceremony. Jake, however, chose this precise moment to escalate his mockery to its most offensive level. "Here comes the really important part," he announced in a voice that seemed to echo across the suddenly quiet courtyard. "We're going to hand each other some keys. This changes everything. The fate of the world hangs in the balance of this key passing ceremony." His words cut through the silence like a knife, shocking the crowd with their inappropriate timing and complete lack of respect. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Hundreds of tourists turned to stare at Jake with expressions ranging from disgust to outright anger. An elderly veteran who had served in the British military during World War II actually stepped toward Jake with his fist raised, stopped only by his wife's restraining hand on his arm. A group of American tourists began loudly distancing themselves from Jake's behavior, with one woman declaring, "Those kids don't represent us." But it was the reaction of one particular guard that would change everything. Sergeant Major William Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the British Army who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, was part of the new guard taking their positions. Unlike the stationary sentries who were trained to ignore all distractions, Sergeant Major Hayes had a different role in the ceremony that allowed him more flexibility in dealing with disruptions to the proceedings. Hayes had been watching Jake's behavior throughout the ceremony, his jaw tightening with each disrespectful comment. As a professional soldier who had dedicated his life to serving his country, he understood the deep meaning behind every aspect of the ceremony that Jake was mocking. The bearskin hats represented regiments that had fought in famous battles. The red tunics honored traditions dating back centuries. And the precision of the drill demonstrated the discipline that made the British military respected worldwide. When Jake's latest outburst coincided with the most solemn moment of the entire ceremony, Sergeant Major Hayes made a decision that would become legendary among the guards and tourists alike. Instead of maintaining the traditional stoic silence, he executed a sharp right turn that brought him face to face with the disruptive teenager. His movement so sudden and precise that it seemed to freeze time itself. The crowd fell completely, silent as Hayes stepped directly in front of Jake. His 6'4" frame towering over the 17-year-old, who suddenly looked very small and very young. The sergeant major's uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect, and his presence so commanding that Jake's confident smirk immediately disappeared, replaced by a look of genuine fear and confusion. "Young man," Hayes said in a voice that carried the authority of 2 decades of military command, "you are witnessing a ceremony that honors the sacrifice of soldiers who died protecting the freedoms that allow you to stand here today and make a fool of yourself." His words were measured and controlled, but they carried a weight that seemed to press down on Jake like a physical force. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary, Phones were raised to record what was happening, and the silence was so complete that Hayes's words could be heard clearly by hundreds of people. Jake tried to speak, to make some joke that would diffuse the situation, but no words came out of his mouth as he stared up at the imposing figure in front of him. This uniform, Hayes continued, gesturing to his red tunic, represents regiments that fought at Waterloo in the trenches of World War I, on the beaches of Normandy, and in the mountains of Afghanistan. The guards you are mocking have served in combat zones around the world, protecting not just British citizens but allies like yourself who seem to have forgotten what respect means. Alex had stopped recording, his phone hanging limply in his hand as he watched his confident friend reduced to stunned silence. Maria took a step backward, suddenly realizing that their behavior had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. Danny felt a mixture of shame and relief that someone had finally stood up to Jake's inappropriate behavior. The sergeant major was far from finished. His years of experience dealing with young soldiers had taught him exactly how to deliver a lesson that would be remembered forever, and he could see that he had Jake's complete attention for the first time. The crowd around them continued to grow as word spread that one of the guards was actually speaking to the disruptive tourists, creating a moment that none of them would ever forget. Hayes took another step closer to Jake, close enough that the teenager could see the metal ribbons on his chest, representing years of distinguished service and personal courage. "These ceremonies aren't performed for your entertainment," he said with quiet intensity. "They're performed to honor traditions that have been maintained by better men than you will ever be, unless you learn to show respect for things that are bigger and more important than your own selfish desire for attention." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity as Sergeant Major Hayes stared down at Jake, his steel-gray eyes conveying decades of military discipline and unwavering commitment to duty. Jake had never encountered anyone like this man before, someone whose very presence commanded respect and whose authority was unquestionable. The teenager's usual repertoire of jokes and comebacks had completely deserted him, leaving him standing there with his mouth slightly open, looking very much like the child he suddenly realized he still was. "Do you know what these guards do when they're not standing here for your amusement?" Hayes asked, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard where hundreds of tourists hung on every word. "They train for months to perfect every movement you've been mocking. They wake up at 4 in the morning to prepare their uniforms to the exacting standards you see before you. They study history, protocol, and tradition so they can honor their predecessors properly." Jake tried to find his voice, to say something that would salvage his dignity in front of his friends and the massive crowd that was now focused entirely on his humiliation. We were just ... he stammered. But Hayes raised his hand in a gesture that immediately silenced him. "You were just..." "What?" Hayes demanded, his voice rising slightly with controlled anger. "You were just showing everyone within earshot that your education system has failed to teach you basic respect for other cultures. You were just demonstrating that American teenagers have no understanding of sacrifice, honor, or tradition. Is that what you were just doing?" The words hit Jake like physical blows. He had never been spoken to like this before, never been forced to confront the reality of his behavior in such stark terms. Back home, his teachers were constrained by policies about student rights and positive reinforcement. His parents had always made excuses for his behavior, blaming his actions on his age or his need for attention. But this man operated under no such constraints, and his assessment of Jake's character was brutally honest. "Look around you," Hayes continued, gesturing to the crowd that surrounded them. "Do you see the faces of the people whose experience you've ruined today? That elderly couple over there saved money for 3 years to afford this trip, and this ceremony was one of the things they were most excited to see. Those children were learning about British history until you decided your entertainment was more important than their education." Jake did look around, and for the first time he really saw the faces in the crowd. The disappointment and anger were clear in their expressions, but what hurt most was the look of shame he saw in the faces of the other American tourists. An older man wearing a U.S. Navy veteran's cap was shaking his head in disgust, while a woman holding a small American flag had tears in her eyes. Jake suddenly realized that his behavior wasn't just embarrassing himself, It was embarrassing his entire country. "These men you've been mocking," Hayes said, indicating the other guards who had maintained their positions throughout the confrontation, "have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They've lost friends to roadside bombs and sniper fire. They've carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. And when they return home, they put on these uniforms and perform these ceremonies to honor the memory of those who didn't make it back." Alex, who had been Jake's partner in mockery throughout the afternoon, was now staring at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Maria had actually started crying, overwhelmed by the shame of her behavior and the realization of how badly she had misjudged the situation. Danny felt a mixture of relief that their inappropriate behavior had finally been called out and guilt that he had participated through his silence. Mrs. Patterson had finally managed to push through the crowd and was standing at the edge of the circle, her face pale with horror as she realized the full extent of what her students had done. She was already mentally composing the letters of apology she would need to write and preparing for the disciplinary actions that would inevitably follow this incident. Hayes wasn't finished with his lesson. "In my 20 years of military service, I've met young people from around the world who understood that respect isn't something you give only when it's convenient or when you feel like it. Respect is something you show because it's right, because it honors those who came before you, because it demonstrates that you're mature enough to recognize that the world doesn't revolve around your need for attention." The crowd had grown even larger as word of the confrontation spread throughout the palace area. Tour guides were bringing their groups to witness what was becoming an impromptu lesson in respect and cultural sensitivity. Many people were recording the exchange, and Jake realized with growing horror that his humiliation was being documented for posterity. "You want to know what the real tragedy is here?" Hayes asked, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its impact. "The real tragedy is that you're old enough to understand better, but you've chosen ignorance and disrespect instead. You're representing your country in a foreign land, and you've decided that mockery and disruption are the messages you want to send about American values and education." Jake felt tears building in his eyes, a mixture of shame, embarrassment, and genuine regret for his actions. He had never been forced to confront the consequences of his behavior so directly, and the weight of Hayes's words was crushing. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he wasn't really like this. He couldn't find the words to express the complexity of his emotions. The sergeant major studied Jake's face for a long moment, seeing the tears and the genuine distress in the teenager's eyes. His expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the compassion that had made him an effective leader of young soldiers throughout his career. Sergeant Major Hayes could see that his words had finally broken through Jake's defensive attitude and reached something deeper, the young man's conscience. The tears in Jake's eyes were genuine, and Hayes recognized the look of someone who was truly understanding the gravity of their actions for the first time. His years of military leadership had taught him when to press an advantage and when to show mercy, and this was a moment that called for the latter. "Now," Hayes said, his voice taking on a slightly gentler tone while maintaining its authority, "you have a choice to make. You can continue being the type of person who mocks what he doesn't understand, or you can use this moment to become someone better, someone who shows respect for traditions, cultures, and the sacrifices that others have made."
Oh.
Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, acutely aware that hundreds of people were watching his emotional breakdown. The humiliation was complete, but somehow Hayes's offer of redemption made it bearable. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't think about ... You didn't think?" Hayes agreed firmly. "That's exactly the problem. You saw something you didn't understand, and instead of trying to learn about it or at least showing basic respect, you chose to mock it. That says something about your character that you need to address if you want to become a man worth respecting." The crowd was listening intently to this exchange, many of them nodding in approval at Hayes's words. Several people had lowered their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something more important than just a viral moment. They were seeing a young person being taught a crucial life lesson by someone who had the authority and experience to deliver it effectively. "Tell me," Hayes continued, "what do you think you should do now? How do you think someone with honor and integrity would handle this situation?" The question hung in the air as Jake struggled to find an appropriate response. he had never been asked to think about honor and integrity before, and the concepts felt foreign and intimidating. Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the mixture of anger, disappointment, and expectation in their expressions. He thought about his parents back home, how they would react if they saw videos of his behavior spreading across the internet. He thought about his younger sister, who had always looked up to him, and how ashamed she would be of his actions. "Should apologize," Jake said finally, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "To you, to the other guards, to everyone here who I disturbed. And I should try to learn about why this ceremony is important, so I understand what I was making fun of." Hayes nodded approvingly. "That's a start. But apologies are just words unless they're backed up by changed behavior. Are you prepared to actually change how you act, or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" The question forced Jake to confront himself more honestly than he ever had before. Was he really prepared to change, or was he just trying to end his public humiliation as quickly as possible? The easy answer would be to say whatever Hayes wanted to hear and then go back to his old ways once he returned home. But something about the sergeant major's presence and the gravity of the moment made dishonesty impossible. "I want to change," Jake said, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. "I don't want to be the kind of person who ruins other people's experiences or embarrasses my country. I just... I don't really know how to be different." Hayes studied Jake's face carefully, using his years of experience reading young soldiers to determine whether the teenager's words were genuine. What he saw satisfied him. This wasn't just a performance designed to escape consequences, but a real moment of self-awareness and desire for improvement. Learning to be better starts with understanding that respect isn't about the other person, it's about who you choose to be, Hayes explained. When you show respect for traditions, cultures, and institutions, you're not doing it for them. You're doing it because respect is a quality that defines good people. And you have to decide whether you want to be a good person or not. The crowd around them had grown even larger, with people streaming in from all directions to witness this unusual scene. Many of the tourists were deeply moved by what they were seeing. A moment of genuine education and character development taking place in real time. Several parents were pointing out the interaction to their children. Using it as a teachable moment about respect and consequences, Alex finally found the courage to speak up. "Sir," he said to Hayes, his voice shaking slightly, "we all participated. In this, it wasn't just Jake. We were all being disrespectful, and we're all sorry." Maria and Danny nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same shame and regret that Jake was feeling. Hayes turned his attention to the other three teenagers, his expression stern but not unkind. "At least you have the courage to accept responsibility instead of letting your friend face the consequences alone. That shows more character than you've demonstrated so far today, but it's still not enough to excuse your behavior." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Sergeant Major, I am so incredibly sorry for my students' behavior. This is completely unacceptable, and I assure you they will face serious consequences when we return to school." Hayes looked at the teacher with sympathy, recognizing the difficult position she was in. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but punishment isn't what these young people need right now. What they need is education and the opportunity to prove they can be better than they've shown today." Ow. The sergeant major's words surprised everyone, including Jake and his friends.
Ow.
They had expected anger, punishment, and humiliation, but Hayes was offering them something much more valuable, a chance at redemption and the guidance to achieve it. What happened next surprised everyone in the crowd, including Jake and his friends. Instead of dismissing them or turning away, Sergeant Major Hayes made an unprecedented decision that would transform their understanding of respect, tradition, and personal growth forever. "If you're truly sorry and genuinely want to learn," Hayes said, looking directly at Jake, "then I'm going to give you an opportunity that most tourists never receive. Tomorrow morning, you and your friends will report to the Wellington Barracks. At 0600 hours, you're going to spend a day learning what it means to be a soldier, what these ceremonies represent, and why the traditions you mocked are worth preserving." The crowd erupted in murmurs of surprise and approval. This was completely unheard of, a royal guard offering disrespectful tourists the chance to actually experience military life and learn about the traditions they had mocked. Several people began applauding, recognizing the extraordinary nature of Hayes's offer and the educational opportunity it represented. Jake felt a mixture of terror and excitement at the prospect. The idea of military training was intimidating, but the chance to truly understand what he had been mocking was appealing, in a way he hadn't expected. "Yes, sir," he said firmly. "We'll be there. All of us." Alex, Maria, and Danny nodded in agreement, though their expressions reflected varying degrees of nervousness about what they had just committed themselves to. Mrs. Patterson looked relieved that the situation was being resolved in an educational, rather than punitive manner, though she was already worrying about the liability issues involved in having her students participate in military training. Hayes continued, his voice carrying to the entire crowd. "You'll learn about the history of the regiments these uniforms represent. You'll understand the sacrifice and dedication required to earn the right to stand guard at these posts. You'll experience the physical and mental discipline that goes into every ceremony you witness today. And at the end of the day, if you've truly learned something, you'll have the honor of observing tomorrow's changing of the guard ceremony from a position of knowledge and respect instead of ignorance and mockery." The educational opportunity was unprecedented. Jake realized that Hayes was offering him something far more valuable than punishment or humiliation. This was a chance to transform his embarrassing mistake into genuine learning and personal growth. The sergeant major was treating him like an adult capable of change, rather than a child who needed to be scolded. "But understand this," Hayes added, his voice taking on a serious tone again. "This is not a tourist attraction or an amusing experience for your social media accounts. This is an opportunity to learn about honor, duty, and respect. If you approach it with the same attitude you showed today, you'll be asked to leave immediately, and your disrespectful behavior will follow you for the rest of your time in this country." The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people approaching Jake and his friends to express their approval of Hayes's solution and their hope that the teenagers would take the opportunity. "Seriously?" An elderly British veteran shook Jake's hand and said, "Young man, you're getting a gift that most people your age never receive. Don't waste it." His words carried the weight of personal experience and genuine hope for Jake's improvement. The rest of their day in London was completely different from what they had planned. Instead of continuing their tourist activities, Jake and his friends spent hours researching the history of the British military, reading about the regiments that participated in the ceremonies, and trying to understand the traditions they had mocked. Mrs. Patterson was supportive of their efforts, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of educational experience the trip was meant to provide. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., four very nervous American teenagers stood outside Wellington Barracks, dressed in their most respectful clothing and carrying notebooks to record what they learned. Jake had barely slept, alternating between excitement about the unique opportunity and anxiety about whether he could meet the challenges that awaited him. Sergeant Major Hayes greeted them exactly at 6 a.m., his uniform immaculate and his bearing as impressive as it had been the day before. "Good morning," he said crisply. "I'm pleased to see that you kept your commitment. It's the first step toward earning respect, doing what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it." The day that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. They learned about military history, practiced drill movements, and heard stories from soldiers who had served in combat zones around the world. They polished boots, studied uniform regulations, and began to understand the incredible attention to detail that went into every aspect of military service. Most importantly, they met other young soldiers who were only a few years older than themselves, men and women who had chosen to dedicate their lives to serving something greater than themselves. These soldiers shared their experiences, their motivations, and their pride in the traditions they upheld. Jake realized that the ceremonies he had mocked represented real people with real stories of courage, sacrifice, and dedication by the end of the day. Jake's understanding of respect had been completely transformed. He no longer saw the ceremonies as empty pageantry, but as meaningful tributes to the values and sacrifices that had shaped British history. When they were invited to observe the next day's changing of the guard ceremony from a privileged position, Jake watched with genuine reverence and appreciation. The experience changed all for teenagers, but it changed Jake most of all. He returned to Philadelphia with a new understanding of respect, tradition, and personal responsibility. The videos of his confrontation with Sergeant Major Hayes did go viral, but instead of being embarrassed by them, Jake used them as opportunities to share what he had learned and to encourage other young people to approach unfamiliar cultures with respect rather than mockery. Years later, Jake would credit that humiliating moment at Buckingham Palace as the turning point in his life, the day he learned that true strength comes not from mocking what you don't understand, but from having the courage to learn, grow, and become better than you were before.